Okay, so we'll start with the spinal cord. Spinal cord, we know that it extends from the foramen magnum, which is the big hole in the skull, and it continues down in adults at the level of disc between L1 and L2. So this is the L1 vertebra, this is the L2 vertebra. So it extends somewhere close to the disc between L1 and L2. In infants, it extends a little bit longer and it goes up till the disc between L2 and L3. So in adults, it is going to be, close to the termination of the spinal cord is between L1 and L2. In infant, it goes a little bit longer and the termination is somewhere here between L2 and L3. But you can see that the spinal nerves are coming from the spinal cord and they have to exit below their corresponding vertebral level. So even though the spinal cord is ending here, these spinal nerves have to travel all the way down to their corresponding vertebral level and then exit out. So this forms, below the termination of the spinal cord, a horsetail-like of structure. You see this? These spinal nerves which are going down and exiting out, they form a horsetail-like of structure, and that is called cauda equina. If you have a disc prolapse here, for example, between L2 and L3, it can affect this cauda equina. And then there would be a syndrome which is called cauda equina syndrome. So if there is a complete disc prolapse which affects these spinal nerves which are going down, it can lead to a cauda equina syndrome. And these nerves, the L3, L4, and S1, they are all supplying where? The lower limbs. So the cauda equina syndrome, if you have, you would affect the paralysis of both lower limb. It might affect the loss of sensation in the genital area. It can also affect the maturation and defecation reflex. So any disc protrusion below this level will affect the cauda equina. So you need to know what is cauda equina. Cauda equina is just the bunch of nerves, the spinal nerves, which have to go down below the termination of the spinal cord to exit out at their particular level. You can also see that as the spinal cord comes down to its termination, it is becoming cone-shaped. Can you make out? It is tapering to form a cone-shaped structure, and that cone-shaped structure is called conus medullaris. It's called what? Conus medullaris. So as it is going to go down, it is going to taper off, form a cone-shaped structure. It's called conus medullaris. From the tip of this conus medullaris, there is a fiber, nerve fiber, which is going down all the way to the tip of the coccyx. And this nerve fiber, the black one which you can see all the way to the tip of the coccyx, is called the filum terminalis. So the nerve fiber which is coming out from the tip of the termination of the spinal cord to the tip of the coccyx is called the filum terminalis. So three terms which we have talked about. One is conus medullaris, which is the cone-shaped tapering of the spinal cord. We have talked about these nerves which are going down, forming the cauda equina, and we have talked about the filum terminal, which is the nerve fiber which originates from the conus medullaris and goes all the way down to the tip of the coccyx, and it's called filum terminal. There are two dilatations of the spinal cord, one in the cervical section and the other one is in the lumbar segment of the spinal cord. So both in the cervical segment of the spinal cord and in the lumbar segment of the spinal cord, you would see dilatations of the spinal cord. Because in the cervical segment, it is supplying the upper limb, that's why you have a dilatation. And in the lumbar segment, it is supplying the lumbosacral segments of the lower limb, that's why you have the lumbar dilatation of the spinal cord. So there are two dilatations of the spinal cord, the cervical and lumbar. Now, usually people get confused between vertebra and the spinal segments. So you need to be very clear about the vertebra. you have 7 cervical vertebra, 12 thoracic vertebra, 5 lumbar vertebra, 5 sacral vertebra, and coccyx. So these are vertebrae. Now, you see spinal segments, there are 8 cervical spinal segments. So there are how many vertebrae here? 7 vertebrae, and there are 8 cervical segments of the spinal cord. So they don't correspond with each other. There are 12 thoracic segments, 5 lumbar segment, and 1 coccygeal segment. That means there are 31 segments of the spinal cord, and each segment of the spinal cord is giving a pair of spinal nerves. So from each segment of the spinal cord, there is a pair of spinal nerve coming out. And where is the spinal cord ending? L1, 2 vertebra. That means that all segments of the spinal cord are going to end at the L1, and L2 vertebral level. So segments of the spinal cord do not correspond with the vertebral levels. So when we talk about vertebral levels, it doesn't mean automatically that it's equivalent to the cervical segments, the spinal segments. Spinal segments are different and vertebral levels are different. So if you have a fracture of L2 vertebra, there is no spinal cord there. So no spinal cord segment could be injured. You can injure the chorda equina there, but you would not be able to injure any spinal segment because all spinal segments are finished. Similarly, if you have a damage to T1 thoracic vertebra, it doesn't mean that it automatically corresponds to T1 spinal segment. So there should be a way how you are going to correspond the vertebral fractures with spinal segments. So they do not correspond with each other because all spinal segments are going to end at L1 and L2 vertebral level. Okay, below that there is no spinal cord. Clear? Everybody is clear about vertebral levels and the spinal segments? There are 31 spinal segments, but they are all going to end at L1 and L2 vertebral level because there is no spinal cord below this. Okay? If we look at the spinal nerves, the C1 spinal nerve exits out above the C1 vertebra, and this happens till the C7 spinal nerve, which also exits out above the C7 vertebra. But the C8 spinal nerve exits out between C7 and T1 vertebra because there is no C8 vertebra here. And below this, all spinal nerves have to exit out below their vertebral level. From T1 onward, all these spinal nerves have to exit out below their vertebral level. This means that your spinal segments are going to end at L1 vertebra. So all these spinal nerves for the sacral segments, for the lumbar segments, have to travel down and then exit out below their vertebral level. You understand this? Everybody? No confusion. So this is the formula how you are going to relate the vertebral levels with the spinal segment. So if you are talking about a cervical vertebra and there is, for example, a damage to C6 cervical vertebra, you add 1 and this would be the spinal segment. So this would be C7 spinal segment. So for any cervical vertebra, add 1. For any upper thoracic vertebra, add 2. For any lower thoracic vertebra from T7 to T9, add 3. So it means if it is T9 thoracic vertebra, it means T12 segment of the spinal cord. T10 thoracic vertebra is at the level of L1 and L2 spinal segments. 11 thoracic is L3, L4. 12 thoracic is L5 segment of the spinal cord. And the first lumbar vertebra is containing all sacral and coccygeal segments of the spinal cord. So if you have L1 vertebral damage, all sacral segments are gone. So all sacral segments are compressed within the area where you have the first lumbar vertebra. So this is a general relationship between the spinal cord segments and the vertebra. So if you see on the X-ray this vertebra is damaged, you can use this formula to find out which spinal segment of the spinal cord is affected. Okay? Below L1, there is no spinal cord. So below L1, if the vertebra is damaged, there is no spinal cord damage. It could be damage to chorda equina, but there could not be a damage to the spinal cord in adults. Okay. Now what you are seeing here is that we have done the laminectomy and we have removed the ligamentum flavum. So we are looking at the spinal cord from the back. We have done the laminectomy, removed the ligamentum flavum. You can see the dura mater here on the side covering the spinal cord, and then you can see the lumbar enlargement of the spinal cord. This is the chorda equina. You can see the filum terminal, the single fiber going to the coccyx. What you should understand is that, like the brain, spinal cord is also covered by meninges. So there is dura mater, there is arachnoid mater, and there is pia mater. The spinal cord is ending at the level of L1 and L2, but these meninges are going to the S2 segment, S2 vertebral level. So you have the subarachnoid space continuing down below the spinal cord to the S2 vertebral level. So if you want to get a sample of the cerebrospinal fluid, you can go into the space below the L1 and L2 to the level of the S2 to get that sample. Okay? So, and that procedure is called lumbar puncture. So what we do is that we found the highest point of the iliac crest. And this highest point of the iliac crest, if you make a line, draw a line from the highest points of the iliac crest, it is going to go between a disc between L3 and L4. So at that point in the center, if you go into the subarachnoid space, you are not going to damage the spinal cord, and you can easily take the CSF. So usually the lumbar puncture is done between L3, L4 or L4, L5, and it is the highest point of the iliac crest which is used as a landmark to find out where to go and where to get the sample for the analysis of the subarachnoid fluid.
Doctor, in newborn, do we go lower than?
Yeah, in the newborn you should go between L4 and L5, and in the adults you can go safely between L3 and L4. Now what you are seeing here is that we have done the laminectomy. You can see the dura mater here. This is the arachnoid mater, and from the arachnoid and pia mater you can see this extension. Can you make out this extension? This teeth-like extension which is going from the spinal cord and attaching the spinal cord to the dura mater. This teeth-like extension is called ligamentum denticulatum. So these teeth-like saw-shaped extensions of the arachnoid and pia mater, which attaches the spinal cord to the dura mater, are called ligamentum denticulatum. And there are 31 of these ligamentum denticulatums which are attaching the spinal cord to the dura mater. So there are two things which are holding the spinal cord into its position, because you know that it's present in the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space is going till S2, and the spinal cord is ending at L1. So what is holding the spinal cord? The one thing is the spinal nerves. So the spinal nerves are exiting out at each vertebral level, so they are holding the spinal cord into its position. The other thing is this ligamentum denticulatum, which is attaching the spinal cord to the dura mater and holding it into its space. So there are two things. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry for interrupting.
No, go ahead.
Can you please further explain how the spinal nerves actually affect the spinal cord? The way you see it's like Vegas just get out and attach.
Yeah, so you know that between two vertebrae there is an intervertebral foramen, and you can see the spinal nerves coming out from the intervertebral foramen. So if you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves exiting out from the intervertebral foramen, they are going to hold the spinal cord in its position. Okay? So they are exiting out like this. Okay. In this diagram, again there are two things which to see. One is you have the dura mater, and then you can see the arachnoid and the pia mater and the subarachnoid space extending to the place where the anterior and posterior rootlets are joining to form the spinal nerve. You can see the subarachnoid space is also extending to the point where the anterior and posterior rootlet are joining. This means that if you put up a dye into the subarachnoid space and then take an X-ray, you would see the dye going into the area where the anterior and posterior rootlet are joining. So if there is any compression to the spinal nerve, you would be able to see that the dye is not going there. Okay? So that myelography helps us to see if there is any compression to the spinal nerves or not. So you just put up a dye into the subarachnoid space through the lumbar puncture, take an X-ray, and you can see that if the spinal rootlets or the spinal nerves are being compressed or not. So this can give you an idea of that, because the subarachnoid space is extending to the point where the two anterior and posterior rootlets are joining. The other thing which you can see, there is an anterior median fissure, there is a posterior median sulcus, there is white matter around the spinal cord, and there is an H-shaped gray matter in the center. There is a posterior gray horn cells, there are anterior gray horn cells, there is a central gray matter, and you can see the central canal which extends upward into the fourth ventricle. In the medulla, this central canal will open into the fourth ventricle. Now, you can see the anterior rootlets. These are the motor rootlets from each segment of the spinal cord. There are posterior rootlets, which are the sensory rootlets. There is a posterior root ganglia, and the anterior posterior rootlets are joining to give rise to the spinal nerve. In the anterior median fissure, you can see this artery, which is called the anterior spinal artery. It's a branch from the vertebral artery. So there are two vertebral arteries joining together, give rise to an anterior spinal artery, which runs in the anterior median fissure. And this anterior spinal artery supplies the anterior two-thirds of the spinal cord. Vertebral artery also gives two posterior spinal arteries, which will run behind the posterior rootlet, and they are going to supply the posterior one-third of the spinal cord. So anterior two-thirds is supplied by the anterior spinal artery, posterior one-third is supplied by the two posterior spinal arteries, which are also the branches of vertebral artery. Now, besides the anterior spinal artery and the posterior spinal artery, there are intersegmental arteries, like in the intercostal arteries are going to give rise to some intersegmental arteries, and similarly lumbar arteries are going to give intersegmental arteries, which are going to supply the anterior part of the spinal cord. And these intersegmental arteries contribute substantially to the blood supply of the spinal cord. If they are damaged, the anterior spinal artery would not be able to keep the blood supply of the anterior part of the spinal cord, and there would be an ischemia. So intersegmental arteries are also very important in the blood supply of the spinal cord. Now we are coming to the spinal nerve first, and then we are going to go back to the spinal cord, internal structure of the spinal cord. We have done the external structure of the spinal cord. We'll talk about the internal structure of the spinal cord. This diagram is just showing you a nerve. So what you have, nerve bundles together giving rise to a nerve. Within a nerve bundle there are a number of nerve fibers. each nerve fiber is covered by endoneurium. And these bundles of nerve fibers are covered by perineurium, while a group of bundles of nerve fibers are going to be covered by epineurium. This is a structure of a nerve. So a nerve would have number of bundles of nerve fibers, and within a bundle there would be a number of nerve fibers. So a number of nerve fibers are going to be covered by endoneurium. Each nerve fiber is going to be covered by endoneurium. Bundles of nerve fibers are going to be covered by perineurium, and then group of bundles of nerve fibers are going to be covered by the epineurium, sorry. This is the structure of a spinal nerve. What you have is a ventral rootlet, dorsal rootlet. Both of them are going to join to give rise to the spinal nerve. Spinal nerve is going to give these communicants to the sympathetic ganglion, and then it is going to divide into a ventral ramus and a dorsal ramus. The ventral ramus is supplying the anterior lateral body wall and the skin and the muscles there, while the dorsal ramus is going to supply the skin over the back and the muscles of the back. The ventral ramus is the one which is going to be important in terms of the formation of the plexices. So when you see the brachial plexus, the lumbosacral plexuses, it is the ventral ramus which takes part into the formation of these plexuses. So this is just the information about the ventral and dorsal roots. You can see the nerve plexuses are formed by the ventral ramus, cervical, brachial, and the lumbosacral plexus. The areas between T2 and T12 segments of the spinal cord do not form any plexuses. So between T2 to T12, these segments of the spinal cord are not involved in the formation of any plexuses. When we talk about dermatome and myotome, dermatome is a portion of the skin which is supplied by one spinal segment or one spinal nerve. Usually your nerves are a combination of several segments. For example, your femoral nerve is a combination of L2, 3 and 4 segments. So it does not represent one spinal segment, it does not represent one spinal nerve. When we talk about dermatome, we are talking about the area of the skin supplied by a single spinal nerve or a single cord segment. Similarly, when we talk about myotome, it is the muscle supplied by a single spinal nerve or a single cord segment. So the nerves supplying a muscle is different because they are coming out from different spinal segments. It's a combination of different spinal segments. But when we are talking about myotome and dermatome, it means one cord segment and one muscle, or an area of the skin and one cord segment or one segment of the spinal cord. Okay. The next important thing is this cross section. And you can see that we have taken a cross section from the cervical part, thoracic, lumbar and sacral part of the spinal cord. Now if you look at the white matter and the gray matter in the cervical segment, there's a lot of white matter here. Why? Because all sensory tracts have to go up, and similarly all descending tracts have to go down. So in the cervical segment of the spinal cord, you would see a large amount of white matter. And also you are going to see anterior gray horn cells to be large. Why? Because they are going to supply the brachial plexus. So you see a large anterior gray horn cells and large amount of white matter. Compare this with the thoracic segment of the spinal cord. Now you have large amount of white matter, but the anterior gray horn cells are very small because they are not going to supply any of the muscles in the upper limb or the lower limb. So anterior gray horn cells are small here. White matter is quite large. So if you compare this with this, the only difference which you can see is that there is a large anterior gray horn cells in the cervical segment of the spinal cord. The other important thing is in the thoracic segment you have the lateral gray horn cells. Can you see these lateral extensions here? The lateral gray horn cells are there because you have the sympathetic supply coming out. So that's why you have the lateral gray horn cells here in the thoracic segments of the spinal cord. If we go to the lumbar segment of the spinal cord, the white matter is reduced now because it only consists of the white matter coming from the lower limbs and the motor pathways going to the lower limb. So white matter is reduced, but again the interior gray horn cells are large here because it is going to supply the lower limbs. In the sacral segment, white matter is minimal, anterior gray horn cells are large, and there would be also the lateral extension in the lateral gray matter because it supplies the parasympathetic nervous system. So these are the differences which you can make between the white matter and the gray matter in the different parts of the spinal cord. So if somebody gives you these cross sections, you should be able to identify which one is cervical, which one is thoracic, and which one is the lumbar segment of the spinal cord. Now we are coming to the internal structure of the spinal cord. And internal structure, first we are going to talk about the gray matter and then we are going to talk about the white matter. So the gray matter, one of the old anatomists was very interested in the morphology of the cells. So he divided the gray matter of the spinal cord into 10 laminae. And these 10 laminae were called rexed laminae, R-E-X-E-D, rexed laminae. We are not interested in the morphology of these cells. That's why we are not going into the different laminae of the rexed laminae and the morphology of the shape of the cells, because it doesn't really help us in clinical practice. What we are interested in is the group of cells and their functions. Okay? So we have divided this gray matter into functional groups. First we are going to talk about the posterior gray horn cells, then we are going to talk about the anterior gray horn cells. So in the posterior gray horn cells, there are 3 collections of cell bodies, or the nuclei we call it. And these nuclei, the one near the apex of the posterior gray horn cells is called substantia gelatinosa. This substantia gelatinosa is present throughout all the segments of the spinal cord. So that means from cervical all the way to the coccygeal segments of the spinal cord, you would find substantia gelatinosa. The function of the substantia gelatinosa is to receive pain and temperature sensations. So pain and temperature sensations are going to go to the substantia gelatinosa. The next group of cell bodies or the nuclei which are present in the posterior gray horn cells is called the nucleus proprius. And nucleus proprius is also present throughout the spinal cord. Throughout the length of the spinal cord, you have nucleus proprius. Nucleus proprius is important because it is going to take the sensations of conscious proprioception. Now, what is proprioception? Yes.
If you close your eyes
Yes.
and let's say for example you are sleeping, how do you feel the environment? That's how its perception works. So say now, this conscious perception is like when you feel the environment around you.
The conscious feeling of where all our body parts are.
Okay. Anybody else?
The sensory signals from the locomotor system,
Okay.
which is basically skin, tendon, ligament.
Okay.
It basically give you a sense that you orient your body parts in relative spatial level.
Good. So there are 2 types of sensations we can feel. One is called exterioception and one is called proprioception. Exterioception means anything coming from outside. That means pain, temperature, touch, pressure, vibration. These are all exterioceptive impulses. Proprioceptive impulses are something which is coming from internal body parts. Your joint and tendon, locomotor, positioning of your body is called proprioception. But proprioception could be conscious. For example, I close my eye and put my thumb up or down. I can know that if my thumb is up or down. So this is conscious proprioception. But sometimes when you are walking, there are positioning cells of your joints which is going to the cortex. And that is without you knowing that how much is flexed your knee, or how much extended your knee is, or how much flexed your ankle is, or your extended your ankle is. This positioning sense is automatically going to the brain because you need to balance yourself. So there is an unconscious proprioceptive sense which is going from your tendons and muscles and from your joints to the brain, and there is also a conscious proprioceptive sense that you would know if I put your thumb up or down, you would know where the position of my thumb is. That is a conscious sense of proprioception. So nucleus proprius is responsible for conscious proprioception. Then we have the dorsal nucleus of Clark, and dorsal nucleus of Clark extends from C8 to L3 or L4 level of L4 segments of the spinal cord, not vertebral levels. So it extends from C8 to L3, L4 segments, does not extend throughout the length of the spinal cord. It is called the dorsal nucleus of Clark, and it is responsible for unconscious proprioception. Okay, so which you do not know. It is going automatically to your brain. That sensation is going through the dorsal nucleus of Clark. So the function of dorsal nucleus of Clark is unconscious proprioception. C8 to L3, L4 segments. The intermediate lateral nucleus is present in the thoracic segments of the spinal cord. These are the cell bodies for the preganglionic sympathetic fibers. Then you have these motor nuclei, which are present in the anterior gray horn cells. And there is a medial group, central group, and a lateral group. So there is a medial, central, and lateral group. The medial group supplies the muscles of the trunk. So neck and the trunk are supplied by the medial group of the neurons which are present in the anterior gray horn cell. The lateral group is mainly present in the cervical segment and the lumbar segment of the spinal cord, and they are supplying the limbs. The central group has certain nuclei. One is the phrenic nucleus, which is important for the diaphragm. The other is the accessory nucleus, which is going to supply the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid. So the central group is only present in the cervical segments of the spinal cord, and it is usually going to form the phrenic nucleus supplying the diaphragm, and the accessory nucleus which supplies the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid. The medial group supplies the trunk. The lateral group is mainly prominent in the cervical and the lumbosacral segments, and it is going to supply the limbs. Yes?
You said dorsal nucleus is responsive to unconscious proprioception. What do you mean by that?
That's what I explained before. Unconscious proprioception is the positioning of your joints and positioning of your tendons without you knowing. So when you are walking, you're not consciously knowing how much extended your knee is or how much flexed your ankle is. The automatic joint positioning is going to your brain. That is a sense of unconscious proprioception. Yes?
Nucleus proprius does extend
Throughout the length of the spinal cord. Next we are coming to the white matter. The white matter consists of tracts which are responsible for taking the sensory information up or the motor information down. So there are ascending tracts or the sensory tracts and descending tracts which are taking the motor information down. Now we divide the white matter into 3 columns. So you have the posterior root here, and between the posterior root and the posterior median sulcus you have the dorsal white column. Between the posterior and the anterior root you have the lateral white column, and between the anterior root and the anterior median sulcus or fissure we have the anterior white column. So there are 3 white columns. One is the posterior white column, between the posterior root and the posterior median sulcus, between the posterior and the anterior root, lateral white column, and then between the anterior root and the anterior median fissure, you have the anterior white column. We will first talk about the sensory tracts or the ascending tracts, and then we are going to talk about the descending tracts. So the major tract which is present in the dorsal white column is fasciculus gracilis, which is seen medially, and then you have fasciculus cuneatus. Fasciculus gracilis is taking the sensations from the coccygeal, sacral, lumbar, and the lower thoracic segments of the spinal cord. So it is taking sensations up to the lower thoracic segments of the spinal cord. Upper thoracic and cervical segments of the spinal cord, fasciculus cuneatus. That's why it is lying laterally. So medial one is taking from until lower thoracic segments the information, and the lateral one, which is the fasciculus cuneatus, is taking the information from the upper thoracic and cervical segments. Now the function of fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus, and they are called the dorsal column tracts, is two-touch discrimination. That means if you touch 2 points of your body, you can discriminate vibration and proprioception, the conscious proprioception. So the function of the dorsal column tracts is to have two-touch discrimination, which is fine touch, vibration, and conscious proprioception. This is the function of the dorsal column tracts or fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. So from until the lower part of the upper part of the thoracic segments, all these information from the body is going to go to the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. Fasciculus gracilis for two-touch discrimination, vibration, and conscious proprioception. So if my joint sense is gone, I cannot find out my lower thumb is up or down, or I would not be able to feel vibration in my lower part of the body. It is fasciculus gracilis which is responsible. If it is lost in the upper part of your body, it is fasciculus cuneatus which is responsible.
Doctor?
Yes.
So that means we don't have fasciculus cuneatus in the lower part of the body?
No. Fasciculus cuneatus is only present in the upper thoracic and cervical segments of the spinal cord. Fasciculus gracilis is present throughout the length of the spinal cord because it is going all the way up. Okay? Clear? Yes.
If the conscious proprioception is lost, how would it present clinically?
It would present clinically in a way that if you close your eyes and I put your thumb up or down, you would not be able to identify. And this will also result in, when you are trying to feel something from your feet or hand, you would not be able to know if your feet is up or down. So it is important for you when you are putting your feet down that your thumbs are touching the ground, or your toes are touching the ground, or your heel is touching the ground. You should know consciously. This is important for you. If you cannot feel this, you would tremble, because if you don't know your heel is touching the ground, or you don't know if your thumb is touching the ground, you would not know the inequality in the surface. It is because of this proprioceptive impulse that you know if the ground is smooth or rough, or it's up or down, whatever you are doing. You're making this judgment based on what the information is going to you consciously. So there is an unconscious information which is going, and there is a conscious information which is also going. You understand that? So both of the proprioception are important for maintaining the balance and for working the way you are working. Okay? The next one is this lateral white column. You have this tract which is called the lateral spinothalamic tract, that is going from the spinal cord to the thalamus. It's responsible for pain and temperature. It's responsible for pain and temperature. It is present throughout the length of the spinal cord. So pain and temperature sensation below the head and neck region is all going into the lateral spinothalamic tract. Then you have anterior spinocerebellar and posterior spinocerebellar. So they are going from spinal cord to cerebellum. Cerebellum is responsible for unconscious proprioception. So anterior and posterior spinocerebellar are important in terms of unconscious proprioception. Then you have this tract which is present in the anterior white column. It's called the anterior spinothalamic. It is responsible for crude touch and pressure. So it is also present in throughout the spinal cord. So you are touched here, but you cannot tell precisely. Crude touch and pressure is the function of anterior spinothalamic. So together, anterior and lateral spinothalamic, they form anterior lateral pathway, which is for crude touch, pressure, pain and temperature. And then you have the dorsal column pathway, which is responsible for proprioception, vibration, and conscious proprioception. So conscious proprioception, vibration, and fine touch or two-touch discrimination is the function of the dorsal column. Anterior lateral pathway is responsible for pain, temperature, crude touch, and pressure. So these are the two major ones which you should remember. One is the dorsal column, the other is the anterior lateral pathway, which is the spinothalamic, lateral spinothalamic and anterior spinothalamic. Then you have these, which are anterior spinocerebellar and the posterior spinocerebellar. Next, we are coming to the motor pathways. In terms of the motor pathways, the most important one, which is there in the lateral white column, there is no motor pathway in the posterior white column. So if the posterior white column is gone, only sensory information is going to go. There is no motor pathway there. So the motor pathway which is present in the lateral white column is the lateral corticospinal tract. It's the most important tract because most of the motor activity which is coming down from the cortex is coming from this pathway, which is the lateral corticospinal tract. Part of this pathway which remains uncrossed is called the anterior corticospinal pathway. So there are two corticospinal, lateral and anterior. Lateral corticospinal pathways are crossed fibers. That means they are coming from the one hemisphere crossing into the other side. So cross fibers are going to form lateral corticospinal pathway, uncrossed fibers are going to form the anterior corticospinal pathway. Because most of the fibers are going to cross, 85%, so major pathway is lateral corticospinal. The smaller one is the anterior corticospinal pathway. These corticospinal, so they are coming from cortex to the spinal cord, they are going to form an elevation in the medulla. And that elevation looks like a triangular elevation. That's why it's called, wherever you see triangular elevation, they call it pyramid. So these pathways are also called pyramidal pathway. So corticospinal pathway is also called pyramidal pathway because it forms an elevation when it passes through the medulla, and it is a triangular elevation. That's why they call it pyramid. So pyramidal pathways, when we say pyramidal pathway, it means corticospinal pathway, lateral corticospinal tract and anterior corticospinal tract. So the rest of the motor tracts which you see here in red, they are called extrapyramidal pathways. So when you say pyramidal pathway, it means corticospinal. The rest of them are extrapyramidal pathways. Now within the extrapyramidal, there is one in the lateral white column, which is the rubrospinal tract. It comes from the red nucleus in the midbrain. That's why it is called rubrospinal. Then you have the reticulospinal in the anterior white column, and you have the vestibulospinal in the anterior white column. So you have vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, and tectospinal tracts which are present in the anterior white column. These are all extrapyramidal pathway. So you cannot see any motor tract in the white matter in the posterior column, but there are two in the lateral white column, which are the lateral corticospinal and the rubrospinal, and the rest of them are located in the anterior white column. Major ones are reticulospinal, vestibulospinal, anterior corticospinal. So these are the major tracts, motor tracts, which are present in the anterior white column. Now you have a monosynaptic reflex arc where you have the sensory input coming from the muscle fibers, going to the anterior gray horn cells, and from anterior gray horn cells you have the motor fibers going to the muscle. So this is an example of a monosynaptic reflex arc. Now this motor neuron which is present in the anterior gray horn cell is called the lower motor neuron. So they are in the motor system, there are two neurons, one coming from the cortex, coming down to the spinal cord in the corticospinal tract, it's an upper motor neuron, and there is another neuron which is coming from the anterior gray horn cells and it is going to the muscle. So this is the lower motor neuron. So there is an upper motor neuron coming from the cortex and there is a lower motor neuron which is coming from the anterior gray horn cells going to the spinal cord. Normally, what happens is that you have the sensory inputs. You have the sensory inputs coming from the posterior root going to the anterior gray horn cells, and the anterior gray horn cells are going to supply the muscle. But there is also an influence from the upper motor neuron which is coming from the corticospinal tract, which is affecting this lower motor neuron. So the overall effect of the upper motor neuron on the reflex arc, although it could be excitatory or inhibitory, but the overall effect is inhibitory. So what happens is that if you damage the upper motor neuron here, the corticospinal tract which is coming down, and it is being damaged and it is not supplying the reflex arc anymore, this reflex arc will become automatic. So what would happen? If you test the reflexes will be hyper exaggerated. You would have hyperreflexia. You have, the muscle bulk will remain intact because the nerve supply to the muscle is there. The tone in the muscle would be exaggerated. So if you test the tone, it would be exaggerated. There would be rigidity in the muscles. So there would be rigidity, hyperreflexia, and the muscle mass will be preserved. On the other hand, if you damage the lower motor neuron and the integrity or the sensory neuron here, the integrity of the reflex arc will be gone. So the muscles will not be supplied anymore. So what would happen? Hyporeflexia, hypotonia, the muscle mass will be reduced because the nerve supply to the muscle is gone. So you have two types of paralyses when you talk about the motor system. One is the upper motor neuron paralysis, where the effect of the upper motor neuron on the reflex arc is gone. You would have hyperreflexia, the spastic type of paralyses. You would have the muscle mass still integrated. So those type of paralyses, if you see rigid type of paralyses, spastic type of paralysis, you have hyperreflexia, you have the muscle mass remain there, then it is an upper motor neuron type of paralysis. Something from the upper motor neuron is not influencing the reflex arc. If the anterior gray horn cells, the nerve itself, or the sensory fibers are affected, then the reflex arc is gone. So the reflex arc is gone, you would have flaccid type of paralysis, you would have hyporeflexia, and the bulk of the muscle is also going to go down because there is no nerve supply. We are going to talk about it in detail, but I just want to introduce because you should know about upper motor neuron type of paralysis and lower motor neuron type of paralysis. If somebody talks about this, you should know what type of features you are going to see. Okay? Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.